Iris asked the question at 7:05 in the evening, standing in the doorway of his study in her nightdress, holding the rabbit she slept with by one ear. She had come to say goodnight. This was the arrangement they had maintained since her mother died 2 years ago. Every evening at 7, without exception, she came to find him wherever he was in the house. Sebastian had initiated it in the specific practical way he initiated most things. He had decided it was important. He had told her it would happen, and it happened. The ritual had become, over time, something he had not anticipated when he designed it, the best part of his day. He was standing at the window when she appeared. He had been standing there for 11 minutes, since coming upstairs after the conversation with his mother, since the sound of Dorothy Marsh's footsteps had crossed the ground floor and the front door had closed, quietly and without drama, the way Dorothy did everything. Iris said, "Where's Dorothy?" He said, "She won't be coming back, sweetheart. She's gone." Iris considered this from the doorway. She had her father's particular quality of stillness, the capacity to receive information and sit with it before responding, which in a grown man looks like composure, and in a 6-year-old looks like something that makes adults slightly uneasy, because children are not supposed to be still that way. She said, "Why?" He said, "It's complicated, Iris." She said, "Did she do something bad?" He said there was a problem at the house, with some things. Iris looked at him. Her head tilted very slightly, the way it did when she was unconvinced by something but had not yet decided how to say so. She said, "Because she doesn't do bad things." "You do bad things sometimes, Daddy, but not Dorothy." The window was cold under Sebastian's hand. He had not been aware that his hand was pressed against it until she said that, and then he became very aware of it. The specific temperature of the glass, the city blurred behind it, the fact that he had not turned around to face his daughter because he was not certain what his face was doing and did not want her to see it. He said, "Go to bed, sweetheart. Thomas will come up." She said, "But Daddy, who reads to me now?" She asked it in the particular tone of a 6-year-old asking a question to which she assumes there is a simple answer, the way children ask questions that contain inside them, coiled and invisible, something enormous that the child cannot see and the adult cannot escape. She was not trying to hurt him. She did not know she had. She stood in the doorway in her nightdress holding her rabbit, and she waited for the simple answer. He did not have one. He said, "I'll come up in a few minutes." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she padded back down the hall, and he heard her door close, and Sebastian Vane stood at the window of his study, with his hand flat against the cold glass, and his daughter's question hanging in the room with him, and he did not move for a very long time. That is what pride does. Not the loud kind, not the pride that shouts and blusters, and can at least be argued with. The quiet kind. The kind that arranges itself as good judgment, as appropriate authority, as the reasonable exercise of control over your own household. The kind that listens to a mother who loves you, genuinely loves you, and has constructed a careful and credible sounding case, and decides. Because deciding is easier than questioning. Because questioning would require you to examine something you have been choosing not to look at, that the case is good enough. Sebastian Vane was 39 years old. He had inherited his father's property development firm at 32, when his father had died with characteristic abruptness, and had run it with the particular focused competence of a man who does not have the option of being anything other than competent. He lived in the family house on Cavendish Row, a Georgian townhouse, 4 floors. The kind of house that requires staff to function and generates in its occupants, over generations, a certain casual relationship with the idea of other people managing the details of their lives. He had a housekeeper, 2 cleaning staff, a cook, and Thomas, who had been in the house since before Sebastian was born, and whose exact role had evolved over 4 decades into something that no job title adequately described. His wife, Cecily, had died 26 months ago. She had died in the specific, devastating way that young, healthy people die, without warning, without the opportunity for preparation, on an ordinary Tuesday in February, and Sebastian had come home from a site visit to find Thomas in the hallway, with an expression that Thomas, in 67 years of life, had never worn before. Iris had been 4. She did not fully understand what had happened for several months, and Sebastian had spent those months doing what he did with everything, managing it, keeping it functional, making the arrangements, and pushing the part that could not be arranged into a room inside himself and closing the door. Dorothy Marsh had come to the house 8 months after Cecily died. She was quiet in her work and precise in her habits, and she had, within 3 weeks, achieved something that Sebastian had not managed in 8 months of trying. She had made Iris laugh. Not the performed, obliging laugh of a child who understands that the adults around her need her to seem all right, but the sudden, uncontrolled laugh of a child who has been genuinely surprised by something funny. Sebastian had been in the hallway when he heard it, and he had stood very still for a moment, and something in him had released a fraction of the pressure it had been holding, like a valve turned just slightly open. Dorothy read to Iris every evening. She had introduced a system she called the vote. Iris chose the book on odd days. Dorothy chose on even days. On Dorothy's days, the books were ones Iris would never have chosen herself and came to love. Stories about places she had never heard of. People who lived differently. Problems that were solved in ways that were not obvious. Iris talked about the books at dinner. She asked questions. She had in the past year developed opinions. Constance Vane had been watching all of this. Constance was 68 years old and had lived, since the death of her husband, in a flat that was 3 minutes from Cavendish Row and represented, in its furnishings and its daily routines, and the particular quality of order Constance maintained within it, a continuation of everything she had always been, a woman of a certain generation and a certain class, for whom the organization of domestic life was not a task, but an identity, and for whom any arrangement that did not reflect this correctly was, at some level, an affront. She visited on Wednesdays for lunch, and sometimes on Sundays, and since Cecily's death, she had been increasingly present in the house in a way that Sebastian found both genuinely understandable and, on his most honest days, something that arrived in every room slightly before he was ready for it. She loved Iris with a fierceness that was entirely real and expressed itself, as great loves sometimes do, in ways that were occasionally suffocating. She loved Sebastian in the specific, consuming way of a mother who has decided that her love is the best protection available and has not yet asked herself what exactly she is protecting him from. She had told Sebastian 3 weeks ago that she had noticed something. She had done it over lunch, after the coffee, when the timing was optimal and Sebastian had nowhere to be for 20 minutes. She was precise about these things, had always been precise about these things, and Sebastian had learned from watching her for 39 years that the precision was not accidental. The kitchen portions, she said. Food being wrapped before Dorothy left each evening. She had asked cook who had confirmed it. She had asked the new junior housekeeper who had also seen it. She had the days logged. She presented it to Sebastian over lunch on a Wednesday with the careful, regretful tone of a woman who does not enjoy being right about this, but is. Sebastian had listened. He had asked, as a precaution, whether Dorothy had been spoken to. Constance said she thought it better to come to Sebastian directly. Sebastian had thought, this is clear, this is documented, this is a pattern of behavior over months. He had thought, I cannot have this in a house with a child. He had not thought, but why? He had not asked Dorothy why. He had called her to his study that afternoon and presented the evidence and told her that her employment was being terminated and that her final wages would be processed by the end of the week. Dorothy had stood in front of his desk with her hands folded and she had listened to all of it, and when he had finished she had said, I don't need you to believe me, Mr. Vane. I need Iris to grow up in a house where the truth is worth saying. I hope she will. I hope you'll still be someone she can say it to. She had looked at him for a moment after she said it. The same direct, unhurried look he had come to recognize. The look of a person who has decided that what she is about to say is true and therefore worth saying regardless of how it lands. Then she had taken her coat from the rack in the hallway and her bag from the kitchen, and she had gone. Now, 11 minutes later, his daughter had come to the doorway in her nightdress and dismantled him in 4 sentences. He went up and read to Iris himself that night. He chose the book she was in the middle of, one of Dorothy's choices, about a girl who builds a boat to sail to a country that does not appear on any map. He read it badly at first, stumbling over the rhythm that Dorothy had apparently established, something in the pacing and the weight given to certain sentences, which Iris corrected twice in the patient, slightly pitying tone of a child who knows how something is supposed to go and is making allowances for the adult who does not. He found it eventually. He read for 40 minutes. Iris fell asleep before the chapter ended, her breathing slow and regular, the rabbit tucked under her chin with the specific completeness of a child who is entirely at rest. And Sebastian sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for several minutes after, the book still open on his knee, in a room lit only by the low glow of the nightlight on the shelf. He looked at his daughter's face in that light. 6 years old. Her mother's mouth. His own stillness, inherited and made her own. The rabbit, which had been a gift from Cecily before Iris was old enough to understand gifts, worn smooth at the ears from 2 years of being held. He thought about what it would mean to be 6 years old, and to have learned, in 2 years, that people you need can simply leave, can be there one morning and gone by evening, and to have arrived at the strategy of asking directly, plainly, without the defensive indirection that adults learn, because you have not yet been taught that some questions are supposed to go unasked. He sat there and he thought about what she had said. You do bad things sometimes, Daddy, but not Dorothy. He thought about the specific quality of evidence his mother had presented, witnessed, logged, consistent. He thought about the fact that he had not once, in the conversation with his mother, in the 3 weeks since she had first raised the subject, in the 10 minutes of the conversation with Dorothy herself, asked the single most obvious question available to him. Why he drove to Dorothy's address the following morning. He had not slept well, which he had expected, and he had been at his desk by 6, which was not unusual. But he had not been working. He had been sitting at his desk looking at the city coming into the light outside his window and thinking about the question his daughter had asked and the answer he did not have for it. By 7:30 he had his coat on. It was early, just before 8, and the city was still assembling itself. The way it does in the hour before the full weight of the day arrives, the delivery vans making their runs, the corner shops open with their shutters half up, the bus stops occupied by people, for whom this hour is simply the beginning of a working day, and has been for years. The street where Dorothy lived was in the part of the city that wakes earliest, because it has to. The part where the margins are tighter and the distance is longer, and the trade-off between rest and function is made differently than it is in the houses on Cavendish Row. Sebastian noticed this without being able to say he had ever thought about it before, which was itself a kind of noticing. The building was a narrow Victorian terrace converted into flats, clean, worn at the edges. The kind of building that has absorbed a great deal of living over a great many years and bears it without complaint. The window boxes on the first floor had been recently watered. The front step was swept. The residents knew each other's schedules here, you could tell. There was an order to the place that had been arrived at through proximity and time rather than management. He knocked. Dorothy did not answer. She had already left, gone to whatever she had instead of the job she no longer had. Her neighbor answered, a woman in her 70s, broad and direct, wearing an expression of cheerful, frank appraisal, the gaze of someone who has met enough people over a long life to have developed a reasonably accurate taxonomy and applies it quickly. Mrs. Osei looked at Sebastian Vane on the doorstep, the coat, the shoes, the car visible at the curb, and said, you'll be the employer. He said yes. She said, she doesn't work for you anymore. He said, I know. I'm trying to understand something. Mrs. Osei looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Saturday morning she goes to the hall on Pemberton Street. Has done for 3 years. You'll find her there. She looked at him one more moment. Mind yourself when you go. Those are people's lives in there, not a spectacle. He said, I understand. She said, "I hope so," and closed the door. He drove to Pemberton Street. He had looked it up on his phone before he left. Pemberton Street, the cross-reference, the approximate location. It was not far from Dorothy's flat, but it was a different kind of street. Shorter, less residential. A street of converted buildings and small enterprises that had the particular quality of streets that have been useful in many different ways over a long period of time. He parked and sat in the car for a moment. The morning was gray and still, the pavement wet from earlier rain. A man was unloading boxes from a van across the street with the practiced ease of someone doing the same thing he did every Saturday. A child on a bicycle negotiated the curb with enormous concentration. None of it had anything to do with him, and yet he felt, sitting in his car in that ordinary street, a specific kind of displacement. The mild vertigo of a man who has driven somewhere he has never had reason to go and is not certain he deserves to be. He got out. He walked to the hall. The building was a converted church annex, that particular Victorian red brick with the high narrow windows and the wooden door, painted a green that had not been repainted in some years. There was no sign outside. No name, no hours, nothing to indicate what happened inside. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The smell reached him before the sight did. Something warm and substantial. Bread. And something slow-cooked and savory underneath it. The smell of a meal being made in quantity with care and without hurry. The smell of a kitchen being used for its truest purpose. It moved through the doorway like something with intention, and Sebastian Vane stood on the threshold and let it settle around him, and felt something in his chest he could not immediately account for, which was, he would later understand, the specific sensation of a person encountering something real after a long time in rooms where very little was. The hall had 8 folding tables arranged in 2 rows, each set with plates and cups that were mismatched, in the way of things that have been accumulated over time from wherever they could be found. The windows were clean. The floor was swept. 3 women were working in the kitchen space at the far end. 2 he did not recognize, and Dorothy, who had her back to him and was stirring something in a large pot with the unhurried, practiced motion of someone who has done this particular thing many times and does not need to think about it anymore. There were already 6 people at the tables. An elderly man eating alone with the quiet, contained dignity of someone who is grateful and has long since decided not to make it complicated for anyone. A young woman with a small child settled on her knee, feeding her small pieces of bread with the specific automatic tenderness that parents develop when feeding becomes less an act and more a reflex of love. Sebastian stood at the door, and he did not move. The young woman, Nadia, though he did not know her name yet, looked up and met his eyes for a moment, then looked back at her daughter. The child had dark curls and was entirely occupied with the bread and had no interest in the man in the expensive coat in the doorway. The elderly man did not look up. The warmth of the room moved around all of them like something with a temperature and a purpose. Dorothy had not turned. One of the other women said something quietly, and Dorothy looked over her shoulder and she saw him. She turned back to the pot. She finished what she was doing. Then she set down the spoon and wiped her hands and walked to the door. She stopped in front of him. She waited. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You didn't know." He said, "I didn't ask." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No." He said, "How long?" She said, 3 years here. Longer in other places. Wherever I was working. Whatever I could manage to carry. He looked past her at the room, at the tables, at Nadia and her daughter, at the old man who had now accepted a second piece of bread from one of the kitchen women, with the restrained pleasure of a man who does not allow himself to look forward to things and has forgotten how to stop. He said, "You never said anything." She said, "Who would I have said it to?" He had no answer for that. He stood in the doorway of that hall on a Saturday morning, and he felt the specific, unambiguous weight of a man who has made a mistake with clarity, not the muddled guilt of someone who was trying and failed, but the clean, cold accountability of someone who had everything he needed to ask the right question and chose not to ask it. He said, "I'd like to fix this, if you'll let me." She looked at him in the direct, unhurried way. She said, "Fixing it isn't a morning's work." He said, "I know." She said, "These people need this place properly funded. A real kitchen, a real space, not someone carrying portions home in a cloth because it's all she can manage." He said, "Tell me what you need." She told him. She was precise about it. Amounts, frequencies, the specific structural requirements, the relationship with the council that would need to be navigated, the question of continuity and who would run it and how. She had thought about this, he understood, for a long time. She had the plans ready in her head. She had simply never had anyone in front of her worth telling them to. He listened to all of it. He said, "There's one condition." She said, "What?" He said, "The name. Iris wants to name it." Dorothy looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but its immediate predecessor. She said, "Does Iris know about this?" He said, "She will by this evening." He went home and told Constance first. Constance was in the morning room with her tea and her newspapers, wearing the composed, orderly bearing of a woman who considers her household decisions settled matters. Sebastian came in and sat across from her, and he told her, calmly and without the anger he had been managing since the previous evening, what he had found on Pemberton Street. He told her about the hall and the tables and Nadia with her daughter on her knee and the old man with the bread. He told her about 3 years of Dorothy carrying food home in cloth, because it was the only way she could do the things she needed to do. He told her that the portions missing from his kitchen had been feeding, on average, 14 people a week. Constance listened. Her expression moved through several adjustments that she managed with the control of a lifetime, and then it settled into something that was not quite what Sebastian had expected. Not defiance, not guilt, but something more complicated, and in its way, more honest. She said, "I wanted her gone, Sebastian. I want you to know that I understand what that means." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because Iris loves her more than she loves me. Because when Iris is hurt, she goes to Dorothy, not to me. Because I am her grandmother, and I have been made, in my own son's house, to feel that I am less necessary than a maid." She stopped. Her hands, folded in her lap, were very still. "I know how that sounds." He said, "It sounds like the truth." She said, "It is the truth." "It doesn't make it right." He said, "No." They sat together in the morning room for a while. Sebastian thought about his mother, about the 68 years of her, about the things she had managed and lost, about what it costs a woman of her generation and her pride to sit in a room and say, "I wanted her gone," without any justification behind it, except the truth. He thought about Iris, who had asked a question she didn't know was a question, and destroyed something in him that needed to be destroyed. He thought about Dorothy Marsh standing in front of a pot in a hall on Pemberton Street, 3 years into a project that no one had ever asked her to do, that she had built from nothing and her own wages, and what she could carry home in a cloth. He thought the people in that hall had never heard of Sebastian Vane, had never eaten in a restaurant he owned, or stayed in a hotel his company developed, or stood in a lobby his architects had designed. They had simply, for 3 years, eaten food that a woman had brought them, because she had decided that was the most important thing she could do with what she had. He called Thomas to the morning room. Thomas came and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been waiting a measured, respectful distance from a situation and has been wondering when he would be called. Sebastian said, "You knew." Thomas said, "I suspected, sir, for some months." Sebastian said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was not my place to say it. It was yours to see it." He paused. "I'm glad you did, sir." It was the only thing Thomas said in the whole affair that required saying. Dorothy came back to the house that afternoon, not in her maid's uniform, but in her own clothes. And Iris, who had been told that Dorothy was coming, was waiting in the hallway with the specific, barely contained energy of a 6-year-old who has been asked to be patient and has given the concept her best effort. She launched herself at Dorothy from approximately 4 feet away. Dorothy caught her and held her and said, into the top of her hair, "Hello, Iris," and Iris said, muffled by the shoulder of Dorothy's coat, "I told Daddy you weren't bad." Dorothy looked at Sebastian over the top of Iris's head. He said, "She did." Dorothy said, "I heard." Iris pulled back and looked at her with the evaluating, proprietorial expression of a child reassessing a situation. She said, "Are you coming back?" Dorothy said, in a different way, "Something better." Iris considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she said, "Can I name the thing?" Sebastian said, "That was the deal." Iris thought about it for the full length of time it takes a 6-year-old to think about something that matters. She said, "The Iris and Dorothy table. Because we both have to be in it." Dorothy looked at Sebastian. Sebastian said, "We can work with that." The Iris Vane Community Table, formally named after some negotiation, with both names present, was established and funded within 6 weeks. It operated from a proper space 2 streets from Pemberton Street with a real kitchen and a real capacity. And it served meals on Wednesday and Saturday evenings, as it always had, plus Sunday lunches, which Dorothy added because Sunday was when it was needed most. Nadia and her daughter came every week. The elderly man, whose name was Harold, came every Saturday and had begun, tentatively, to sit with other people rather than alone, which Dorothy said was the most significant development in 3 months of operation, and which she reported to Sebastian with the specific, understated satisfaction of a person who measures progress in the right units. Constance came on a Sunday in the 3rd month. She came without announcing it, which was, Sebastian understood, its own form of courage. She sat at one of the tables and she helped serve, and she did not make it about herself. And afterward, Dorothy said, to Sebastian and no one else, that his mother had good hands in a kitchen and had known, without being shown, where everything went. Sebastian said, "She ran a household for 30 years. Dorothy said, "It shows." It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was the beginning of the conditions under which forgiveness becomes possible, which is a different thing and in many ways more durable. On the morning of the foundation announcement, Sebastian found the drawing. He had opened the kitchen cupboard, the small one near the window, where Dorothy had kept her things during her time in the house, to look for something, and it was there on the inside of the door, exactly where she had pinned it, a drawing in wax crayon, slightly faded from the months it had been there. 2 figures, one tall and one small, holding hands. The tall one had yellow hair, because Dorothy had yellow hair, and Iris's crayon instincts were literal and confident. The small one had what appeared to be a crown, which Sebastian chose to interpret as a headband. Underneath, in the careful, large, earnest handwriting of a child who is still learning, Dorothy. He stood at the open cupboard door and looked at it for a long time. Then he took it down carefully and brought it upstairs and put it in a frame and hung it in his study, where it remained. Iris noticed it 3 days later. She stood in front of it with her hands on her hips and said, "I spelled it wrong." He said, "It's perfect." She said, "It's not spelled right." He said, "It's the best thing in this room." She looked at it for another moment, with the critical, unsatisfied expression of someone who knows they can do better. Then she went to find Dorothy to ask her to check the spelling next time, and Sebastian heard them in the hall, Iris explaining the problem, and Dorothy saying that the wrong spelling was her favorite version, and Iris saying that was not how spelling worked, and Dorothy saying that some things worked differently when they were drawn with love, and Iris going quiet for a moment and then saying, "Is that true?" And Dorothy saying, "In this house it is," and Iris accepting this with the provisionally satisfied nod of a 6-year-old who has decided to believe something and reserve the right to revisit it. If you have ever been asked a question you could not answer by someone who did not know they were asking it, if a child has ever looked at you with the clear, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has not yet learned that the truth is sometimes unwelcome, and said simply, But why then you know what Sebastian Vane knew in that study at 7:05 on a Tuesday evening. You know the specific quality of being seen by someone who loves you and does not know how to pretend otherwise. You know that there is no argument available against it, and no management strategy that applies, and no version of composure that survives it intact. She did not mean to destroy him. She was 6 years old, and she wanted someone to read to her, and she was asking a reasonable question about a thing she did not understand. That was exactly why it worked. Because the questions children ask are the only ones that cannot be managed, deflected, or survived with dignity intact, they go straight through every wall a grown person has spent a lifetime building. And they ask, in the simple language of someone who has not yet learned that the truth is supposed to be complicated, why exactly did you do that? And can you live with the answer?